We're going to start loading dynamic content for our component. Uh, I have two different kinds of repositories here. The one is for form items and the other one's for text items. We have one list of items for list and a separate list of items for grid. And the reason why we want to do that is because the list items are quite plain. There's no imaging. It's just normal allies. But on the grid items, you can have images that show you what that component looks like. And we want to keep those things a little bit separate and just load the items that you're interested in. And so what we are looking for is a way to say, okay, well, show me the form repository items either for the list or the grid, or show me the text repository items either for the list and the grid. So how do we do that? We already know that we have the display status for list and grid, but the next thing that we need is to have the repository name for our component to use. This is where our component is being used, and we want to make this thing dynamic, so I can have other systems affect this component from the outside by setting an attribute, or I want to be able just to write it statically. And the way to do that is to add a data-attribute that we'll call repo, and this will contain either one of two values. It'll contain the word form or the word text, and then we'll use convention over code to determine what to load here. So the first part of this word is what we need to define in the repo. So we'll just say here form for now. And then the second part of the convention is then either list or grid, but we already have that on the display. Let's go and put this together. We're going to need a function that helps us load the HTML. So let's go and do that quickly. We'll just call this load HTML. And we know that there's a convention that we want to use. So we can say const path is equal to, we know it's at the root. It's going to use the templates folder. It's also going to use this component's name to keep all the repository items together. And then the next part is our repository name that we put on the data-attribute. So that will be this.dataset.repo that we plug in here. Then we know that the name has a dash in between, and then we want to use the display status. So let's go and get that quickly. So we'll say display status is equal to this.get property display status, and we'll plug that into here. And we'll say use my display status for me, and it's then followed up by a .html. Once we have that path, now we can start loading the stuff up. But before we do anything, we want to make sure that this part of our equation actually works. For now, let's just do console.log path. And we want to make sure that this thing is called every time that the display status changes. So we can take that out now and say this dot perform that action for me. Now there's one sort of problem. We're going to be using the fetch API in here, so this needs to be async. And because that's async, we will have to await this here. And because we need to await this here, we'll have to make this thing async. Now we are ready to go and test. Refreshing the browser, we can see that it logged this out for us from our function. All we need to do now is go and see whether this is actually correct. So we'll take that out of our pathing and stick that in, and voila, there's our items. So we know that our pathing is correct. We can now go and load it using our fetch API. Nothing fancy but the fetch API. So we'll just say await fetch that path for me, and when it returns, take the result and convert that to me to text. If we can type today. So go and fetch that, then go and get the result and make it a piece of text, and again we'll just say const HTML is equal to that, and we're just going to log that out, because before we do anything, let's make sure that what we have actually functions. Refreshing the browser, we see that it displays the content of the file that we're loading. It is indeed the right content that we're looking for, so now all we need to do is go and plug it in here. What we want to do is go and grab our UL. So we want to say whatever our UL is, dot inner HTML is equal to this HTML that we have received. But I don't want to go and deal with querying for the UL and then remembering to clean up the memory afterwards. I just want the binding engine to kind of take care of that for me. To do that, I'm going to put in a reference here. So I'm going to say ref is equal to, and we will just call it container. And this will create a property for me on the binding context that I can then use to do my HTML. So I can say this.container.innerHTML is equal to that. But since we're doing that, we might as well take that out, stick that in there, and make that a little bit neater. So what do we have here? We get the display status. We have the repo that's defined on the data-attributes. We combine that using a convention to determine the path of the repo that I want to go and get my content from. I'm using the ref to set a property to that element for me on the binding context, and I set that element's inner HTML to the content that I have just gone and fetched. When we refresh the browser, we'll see that my content items have now loaded. When I click on the grid, it goes and fetches the grid items for me. I can clear my traffic here. Click on the list, you'll see that it downloads the list items. Click on the grid, it downloads the grid items. If you have caching enabled, that's not a problem, it'll just cache it for you. But now we have our actual content also loading. The next and last step, well, not the last step, the second last step. The next step for us is to say, okay, well, if I change this repo and I make this text as an example, I want this component to go and respond accordingly. How do I do that? As part of standard web components, and since the bindable element is just an extension upon vanilla web components, you can use the attribute change callback. The first step to do on the attribute change callback is to define a static read-only property called observed attributes, which tells the component, listen to the following defined attributes, and if they changed, I want you to execute a callback function. And in this case, because we're using the data-repo attribute to define what the repository is, that is the attribute we want to listen to. The next step for us is to define the attribute change callback. This is a name that is specific to the specification, so you have to use a function with this name. It contains three parameters, the name, the old value, and the new value. We're not actually going to be using any of those because we're only listening to the one attribute that's changed, and whenever this thing changes, we by default want to load the HTML. So we can just say this.load HTML, and we can make this async so we can await this. Let's go see what happened in the browser. Since we have now added this and we refresh our page, you can see that we're running into a small problem now where it says, look, I can't find this thing because part of what I'm expecting to be there is missing. So I need the data-attribute to be there, but also I need to wait until the display status is ready to do this. And that is because the attribute change gets called before the preload is fired. So we can just put a check in here and say only perform this operation when all of my required properties are available. So we added a if statement on our load to say go and check if the display status is null or whether the data repo is null, and if either of them is null, just return, don't continue with anything. The reason why we use the double equals null is because it'll catch undefined and null values without having to define if it is undefined or if it is null. I can just use the one statement to catch it all. Going back to the browser, we can see now that when we refresh, our error message is gone, and we can change still and everything works fine. But let us go and change the repo on this component to text. And by changing that repo, we can now see that our text items are showing, and when I go to the grid, I'm showing my text grid items, and I'll change this back to form. Now keep in mind that we were on the grid before, so we expect to see the forms grid items, and if I change the list, then I see the forms list items.